Reflecting its former preeminence, Merseyside can boast an impressive number of firsts in the history of transportation. Liverpool was one of the termini of the world's first railway using steam locomotives to haul passenger carriages and goods wagons along iron rails. In 1980, the 150th anniversary of the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was commemorated in style with a cavalcade of historic locomotives operating through Rain Hill, site of the original locomotive trials of 1829. Included in the cavalcade were replicas of 3 locomotives which had participated in the trials. One of the oldest surviving stations in the country is at Edge Hill, the present passenger accommodation occupying the original 1836 offices. Lime Street, Liverpool's most famous station, was first opened in 1836, but the oldest remaining parts of the present station complex date from 1846. The bulk, however, is from the period 1867 to 1879. The 2 highly distinctive iron-built train sheds each has a span of 200 feet. Lime Street was always Merseyside's premier station. These views, taken in the mid-war years at the height of the steam age, when the railway network had not, as yet, been seriously challenged by the rise of the motor car. There were several steam motive power or loco sheds in the Liverpool area. The work was demanding, dirty and labour-intensive. In its heyday, Edge Hill had been responsible for maintaining and servicing both express passenger locomotives as well as scores of freight engines for the dock traffic. These views, dating from 1967, show the depot in its final run-down state as it approached the end of its active life. With increasing modernisation, facilities for coaling, watering and turning locomotives would no longer be required. The engines in these scenes were among the last types to survive. Of basic LMS design, they included Class 5 460s and Class 8 280s. On the Wirral, diesels ousted passenger steam trains on the Birkenhead-Chester line in March 1967, leading to the closure of Woodside Station Birkenhead in the November. Steam on the Wirral finally disappeared altogether when the massive 9Fs, which hauled iron ore trains between Bidston Docks and the steelworks at Shotton, were withdrawn. These impressive 210Os were relatively new machines, ideally suited for working heavy trains over steeply graded routes. But the march of modernisation condemned them to the scrapyard well before their time. No one will ever forget the sight and the sound of a 9F in full flight storming through the Wirral Peninsula. It was possible to hear the bark of the exhaust over 10 miles away. In at the beginning, in at the end. As the number of steam engines dwindled, Liverpool became a mecca for enthusiasts. And it was from Lime Street that the last steam-hauled passenger train on BR made its departure in August 1968. Thousands gathered to watch the 15-guinea special on its final journey. Fittingly, a stop was made at Rain Hill, where the Merseyside steam story had all started. The Industrial Revolution, together with the arrival of the railways, transformed Liverpool into one of the country's major ports. It became known throughout the world as the second port of the empire, developing increasingly into a commercial rather than an industrial centre, although thousands found employment in and around the vast dock estate. Today's activity is primarily centred upon the busy Freeport, which handles as much, if not more, tonnage than in the heyday of the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board, but most is in large container ships. Gone are many of the older vessels. Gone too are some of the docks. Gone are many of the shipping lines which once regarded the Mersey as their base. Gone as well the seemingly endless exporting of British-built heavy machinery and equipment. Gone completely are the liners, which once sailed to all parts of the globe from Prince's Stage, the longest floating structure of its kind in the world. It was even served by its own station, opened in 1895, passengers being able to alight at Riverside for direct access to the liners. The vessels themselves were household names for generations of Merseysiders. One of the most loved and admired was the four-funnel Cunarder, the first Mauretania, launched in 1906. The two-funnel Mighty Whites were owned by the rival White Star Line. Both companies crossed the Atlantic. Eventually they amalgamated to form Cunard White Star. The liners were the undisputed monarchs of the ocean. They were always surrounded by non-stop bustle, which brought a sense of excitement and colour to the waterfront. They also provided employment for thousands of men, from masters to stokers, from pursers to stewards. However, it was not all caviar and dance bands. Tragedy did strike, especially during the Second World War, when scores of ships were lost at sea, including the Canadian Pacific's Duchess of Athol. She is seen here embarking from the stage in 1934. In 1953, her sister ship, the 20,000-ton Empress of Canada, was destroyed in one of the most spectacular fires in the history of the port. In Europe's biggest ever salvage operation, it took 14 months to raise the charred and blackened hulk from the floor of the dock. Her successor, the third and final ship to carry the name Empress of Canada, proved to be the last of the White Empresses. Embarking on her maiden voyage to Montreal in 1961, she had had a crew of 500. All at first had seemed well, but the tide was turning swiftly against the whole concept of ocean travel. The aeroplane was both quicker and cheaper. This graceful 25,500-ton vessel was eventually to earn the dubious distinction of being the last major liner to depart from Liverpool in November 1970. The passing of the elder Dempster's Oriole on the 16th of March 1972 marked the end of a magnificent period in Liverpool's maritime history. In summer, thousands of Merseysiders would relish the prospect of a good breezy journey on board one of the little liners, which operated from Liverpool to Llandudno. The Llandudno is seen leaving the stage in 1956. Launched 30 years earlier, she had accommodation for nearly 2,500. She made her last voyage on September the 16th, 1962. The St. Trillo, launched in 1936, was used mainly for local cruise work in and around Llandudno. The Isle of Man Steam Packet Company has had a long association with Liverpool, although in recent years it has been more off than on. Like their big sisters, the little liners of the Isle of Man service were known by name to everyone on Merseyside. They even had hooters which sounded similar to those on Cunard vessels. Crossing over the water, one of the major employers on the Wirral side was the camel-led shipyard at Birkenhead. During an illustrious career, it launched many legendary fighting ships for the Royal Navy. One of the most famous was undoubtedly the first Ark Royal. Launched in 1937, she had a brief career, being sunk by enemy action in 1941. Any launch always aroused a degree of curiosity, but if a major ship was involved, the excitement would reach fever pitch. Probably the most memorable launch in the history of the yard was that of the second Mauretania on July the 28th, 1938. At over 35,500 tons, the luxury liner was then the largest vessel built in England. 7,000 men had been employed in her construction, with another 150,000 in fitting her out. She had accommodation for a total of 1,500 passengers. Known locally as Morrie, she was a true child of the Mersey. She remained in Cunard service until withdrawn for scrap at the end of 1965. The Windsor Castle was the largest liner ever launched from the yard in 1959. After the loss of the liners, it is the closure of the overhead railway which causes the most regret. It was a totally unique local institution. No one else had one. The overhead could also boast an impressive list of firsts. It was the world's first electrically operated elevated railway, the first to employ automatic coloured light signalling, and one of its stations even had the first public escalator. Opened progressively between 1893 and 1905, the railway eventually linked Dingle in the south with Seaforth and Litherland in the north. Every visitor to Merseyside was urged to ride the overhead, and indeed there was something special in looking down from the elevated structure onto the busy roads beneath. Once a year, the trains even carried racegoers to the Grand National at Aintree. But its prime purpose was purely functional. It had been built to overcome congestion on the Dock Road by whisking workers along its elevated tracks at speeds far in excess of the crawling lines of traffic on the Dock Road. Its regular users were those employed in and around the dock estate. During inclement weather, when the Mersey rain would drive downwards not like cats and dogs but like stair rods, the overhead structure provided a protective cover, and for this reason it was always known as the docker's umbrella. It was the projected high cost of renewing the decking on the overhead structure which brought the privately owned railway to its knees. No financial support was forthcoming, and the elderly rolling stock made its final journeys at the end of December 1956. No one seemed to appreciate what had happened. A priceless part of the city's folklore had been allowed to slip away. At the same time, another group of highly distinctive electric trains was being sent for scrap. Like the overhead, they too owned a considerable debt to railway design and operation in America. Since 1903, they had worked on the first railway in the country to be completely converted from steam to electric. The Mersey Railway too was privately owned, but unlike the overhead, it had been nationalised in 1948. Initially, the American-style stock had shuttled back and forth through the tunnel linking Liverpool Central with either Rock Ferry or Birkenhead Park, but in 1938, with electrification of the lines to West Kirby and New Brighton, they had escaped into the countryside and the sand dunes. The last set was withdrawn in 1957. They were replaced by units based upon a design introduced by the LMS onto their Wirral electric lines in 1938. These gave yeoman service, the last being withdrawn in 1985 to be replaced by the current rolling stock. LMS-designed electrics dating from 1940 were familiar and regular performers on the heavily used commuter lines radiating out from Liverpool Exchange to Southport and Ormskirk. Both types of LMS stock survived long enough to operate through the new tunnels opened in 1977. Known as the Loop and Link, these transformed local rail travel. The reorganisation did, however, lead to the closure of Exchange Station, although the facade has been retained. The early electrification of the Mersey Railway had a profound effect upon the ferry services. The trains were unaffected by adverse weather conditions, they made the under-river journey in 3 minutes, and they terminated in the heart of Liverpool. The ferries had been among the first in the country to come under municipal control. Until 1929, a variety of ferries crossed the river from Eastham in the south to New Brighton in the north. At their height, the steam-powered vessels operated at frequent intervals during the rush hours, with each boat carrying hundreds of passengers. Night boats were also provided, and during the summer additional vessels were run to New Brighton. The ferries arrived and departed at the southern end of the giant landing stage. Both Birkenhead and Wallasey operated goods or luggage boats. Access to all 3 major termini was eventually by means of a floating roadway, where an incredible mixture of cross-river traffic would assemble. It required skill and ingenuity on the part of the ferry staff to squeeze as many lorries, cars and motorcycles, as well as horses and carts, onto the slippery decks. The luggage boats became an increasing irrelevancy following the opening of the first road tunnel in July 1934, although the Seacombe service survived until 1947. Loadings on the passenger ferries were also affected by the opening of the tunnel. Some of the crossings, like Rock Ferry, closed altogether. These views in fact being taken on the last day of service in 1939. Whilst those to New Brighton were reduced to seasonal operation only. The classic ferry steamers were slowly withdrawn, being replaced by smaller, less expensive boats. The last of the traditional vessels was the Wallasey. Built in 1927, she made her last crossings in 1963. The most unusual vessel of recent years was the revolutionary diesel-electric Royal Iris, delivered in 1951. Equipped with a dance floor, bars and other eating places, she could cater for the cruise trade as well as being a regular passenger ship. Initially, she was subjected to all manner of derision, being nicknamed the floating fish and chip shop. Here she is seen in 1960, handling the crowds waiting to embark for New Brighton. Despite the growing number of cars, thousands of day trippers would still cross to New Brighton at the first sign of good weather. However, faced by falling traffic and plagued by drifting sandbanks, the last boats made the 25-minute crossing in September 1971. Once it even looked as if the famous ferries might disappear altogether. The number of vessels has certainly been reduced, even the Royal Iris finally reaching the end of the road after over 40 years of service. Today, a trio of former Birkenhead Corporation boats are sufficient for the present level of ferry activity. Another first, this time at Birkenhead, where the first horse-drawn street tramway in the country was opened in 1861. In recognition of this, a tourist tramway is to operate from Woodside, site of the terminus of the original line. Birkenhead gradually progressed to electric trams, which ran between 1900 and 1937. All the routes terminated at Woodside, where connection was made with the corporation's ferry boats. Included in the fleet were some former single-deckers, rebuilt as double-deckers. These worked exclusively on the new ferry route abandoned in 1931 and were reputed to be among the noisiest trams in Britain. Wallasey's electric trams all operated between Seacombe and New Brighton via different routes. These rare views were taken at Liscard in 1933. Whilst Birkenhead and Wallasey were scrapping their trams, Liverpool was embarking upon a policy of modernisation. The central terminus at the pier head was dominated by three large turning circles. Here a constant stream of trams would swallow up the passengers swarming off the ferries. The city's older short wheelbase trams hardly had a reputation for smooth riding. Improvements were made over the years, including the provision of enclosed top decks. This tram is carrying a postbox. But it was the arrival of hundreds of modern bogie cars built in the corporation's own workshops which for a brief period altered the public's perception of the tram. The first of these, which appeared in 1933, sported a new green and cream livery, and they were instantly dubbed Green Goddesses after a popular film of the day. The name was eventually indiscriminately applied by the public to all the trams built between 1936 and 1942. After the war, the system was in poor shape, and the decision was taken to replace the trams by buses starting in 1948. Following the scrapping of many older trams and the relaying of much of the track, the remainder of the network was in good condition by 1952 and could have formed the basis of a modern light rail network. One of the most impressive features of the Liverpool system was the provision of segregated grass tracks or reservations, especially in the suburban areas. Here the Green Goddesses could show a fine turn of speed. Eventually, 27 miles had been built. The final reserve track extensions took the trams out into the open countryside around Gilmoss, South Dean and Kirby, the last stretch opening as late as 1944. These were served mainly by routes 19 and 44, which were the penultimate routes to be replaced. Walton Depot was also closed to trams at the same time. The last two routes served Edge Lane. They were replaced on the 14th of September 1957. As the final procession of 13 cars left the pier head, every ship on the river sounded its hooter. Gone were the penny chile returns, the frequent services, and the miles of reserved track. Another lost opportunity. Speke is situated about 6 miles to the southeast of the city centre. The airport was formally opened on the 1st of July 1933, but the complete complex of buildings, hangars and control tower was not completed until just before the outbreak of World War II. The airport had been built on land acquired by the corporation in 1928. Hand-loading baggage onto a DC-3 in 1951. Speke has never enjoyed the same prestige as Manchester's Ringway. The transatlantic shipping routes which disappeared during the 1960s were not replaced by flights from Liverpool. Much of the traffic had been either short-haul European flights or to places within the British Isles, but in recent years there has been an increase in flights to destinations further afield. It was possible to cross the Mersey by ferry, rail and road, and until 1961 by transporter. One of only 4 in Britain, it spanned not only the river but also the Manchester Ship Canal. Opened in 1905, it was owned and operated by Widnes Corporation. When built, it fulfilled a vital local need. The nearest vehicle crossings have been at either Birkenhead, 13 miles downstream, or at Stockton Heath, Warrington, 6 miles upstream. Swinging over the expanse of water could be quite nerve-wracking for the uninitiated, especially in stormy weather, when the travelling bridge would appear to sway from side to side. The vehicles were carried on a platform which had covered accommodation for foot passengers on the seaward side. In making the crossing at high water, the platform was suspended only 12 foot above the river and 4 foot 6 inches above the canal embankment. The platform was hung from a moving trolley, which ran on 32 wheels and was powered by 2 35 horsepower motors. When it closed, the single fare was 2 old pennies for vehicles and 1 old penny for pedestrians. The transporter had a span of 1,000 feet and was supported by 4 190-foot towers. As traffic rapidly increased after the war, lengthy queues would form on either side. The transporter could no longer adequately serve the needs of the district and was replaced by a new road bridge. This was a smaller version of the one across Sydney Harbour. The transporter closed in 1961. Yet another piece of Merseyside's richly fascinating transport history was all too swiftly dismantled. Many of the subjects in this tape are covered in more comprehensive detail in a range of highly acclaimed online video tapes. To guarantee profits go towards local tramway restoration projects, please order direct from the Merseyside Tramway Preservation Society.